Good. So yeah, I'm going to go through quite a lot today, and I apologize for that. And I'm not going to talk very much about enculturated imagination, so that's a bit of a misleading title, but I'm hopefully going to get there at the end. So we'll see how it goes. So rough plan is I'm going to try and as quickly and perhaps as simply as possible just introduce the predictive, what I'm going to call the predictive mind. And you'll see that I'm going to offer some reasons why I want to kind of distinguish this from perhaps the view that's known as predictive processing. So trying to kind of put this forward in the most general way possible. And then I'm going to look at various different ways that you might kind of try and construe how imagination works within this framework. So it's going to be a series of kind of suggestions of how you might construe it, followed by a problem. So we've got Clark and Kirchhoff have both written quite a lot on this. I think they face this problem of ubiquity. Then we have various problems for each of the kind of refinements of an attempt to explain imagination within this framework. And I'm going to end up trying to kind of wave my hands around a lot about this possibility that we need to think about imagination as being enculturated. But hopefully we can maybe talk more about it in the chat, because I might not have a huge amount of time to talk about that. Really importantly, I've got to thank Sam Wilkinson for all the work he's done helping me with this. In that this is largely based on collaborative work we did for our paper for the Cambridge Handbook of the Imagination on from prediction to imagination. So that was kind of largely a negative case. Now I'm going to be trying to point towards what might be a sort of more positive case. So let's see how that goes. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to try and do a very quick introduction to the predictive mind. So I think it's easiest to really understand what's going on here by considering what's different in the predictive mind case from a kind of classical view of how the mind works. So here we've got the now well-known classical cognitive sandwich model, as Susan Hurley pointed to. And I think, this is it's very intuitive as to how we think about the mind. So we get this information in from perception. It's all fed forward until we kind of have a rich model of the world that we can then do some thinking about, and then sometimes that's going to cause action. You should all be familiar with it. So then we can hone in a little bit on how perception is usually seen in this context. So one way that you might understand this is along kind of roughly the lines of Mars' classical computational view of perception. And you can kind of see, and this should be really natural to what as we kind of, it's a very intuitive way of thinking about how perception works. You start with kind of impoverished information on the retina, and then gradually kind of build up a richer model of the world, incrementally making it more rich and more complex as it kind of moves inwards, feeds forward into your mind. And so that makes lots of sense. It's how things feel like to us from the inside. And the really key thing here, right, is it's feed forward. Now, as being probably clear from the previous talk, the key bit about the predictive processing or predictive mind framework is to see the kind of flow of information is going in the other direction. So instead, we have this top-down flow of information. And importantly, there is still some information flowing upwards into the mind, but that's merely the prediction errors, right? So we have lots of layers of the hierarchy, each trying to predict what's going on at the layer below. And similarly to the Mars kind of framework, we have more kind of abstract, maybe more rich kind of categories at the top, and get more and more fine-grained and spatiotemporally small as we get closer to the sensory periphery. So yeah, that more lovely pictures that you've probably seen lots of these before. So importantly, when the lowest level of the hierarchy is going to be kind of right at the periphery of your brain, making very fine-grained, short time scale and small spatial resolution predictions about what's going on, for example, at some small part of the retina. So lots and lots of rapid predictions going on there. And then as we get to higher and higher levels in the hierarchy, we get more high-level predictions about kind of more spatiotemporally extended things, and what people in this framework talk about as being things that are increasingly abstract. Now, importantly here, this doesn't necessarily, it's not going to be increasingly abstract in how philosophers might often use the term abstract. We're not talking about kind of Platonic forms here, just perhaps what the idea there is it becomes more multimodal or less kind of unimodal at least. And importantly, I've added on here, right, sort of picture of the heart and the guts. It's not merely predictions about stuff coming in from your kind of sensory modalities, right? There's going to be interoceptive predictions that are very important for emotional, explaining emotion in this context, and proprioceptive predictions, as we'll see. And really importantly, right, the fundamental imperative of the brain is to minimize overall prediction error on average over time, right? So we've got this unified function that really all of the kind of things that the brain does are in the service of this one imperative, and that's going to be important. So you then kind of think, well, what does this mean for our traditional cognitive sandwich model? At the very least, right, it seems that we've kind of got this flipping of the relation between cognition and perception. That's one way of seeing it, at least. And what's important here is that the model becomes symmetrical rather than asymmetrical. What's going on in terms of the relationship between cognition and perception is a lot closer to kind of what we always thought was going on in the relation between cognition and action. It's about predicting what the future is going to be like, and anticipating what the future is going to be like, and, you know, correcting on the basis of errors to adjust the predictions. And I think one of the important things about this, and this was highlighted by Maina, is that this means that the kind of normal ways we understand the boundaries between these types of process are going to get very blurred, right? In some ways, the way that the asymmetrical nature of the classical cognitive sandwich model allows us to have very clear distinctions between cognition and perception and cognition and action, and now things just get a bit more messy. So I think this is a nice way of kind of understanding things. We have a kind of, you can think of a kind of wheel with lots of spokes, with each kind of spoke of that wheel bottoming out in some kind of sensory periphery of some sort, right? So, but as we get closer to the center of the wheel, things get less kind of unimodal and more abstract. Ignore all the red lines on this. I don't think they're playing any role. I just couldn't find another version of this picture. Okay, so that's kind of the basic idea of how our kind of perception works on this model. Now I'm just going to add in some of the other important features of the model. So as I kind of was jabbering on about just now, there's the important thing of attention. And this is closely related in the predictive processing model to the notion of precision. So this is going to be hard to imagine, but remember those times when you're in a really busy, loud room with lots of other people, or perhaps if you're walking, maybe more likely to be something that's happened recently, been walking in a misty kind of moors or something like that. There's going to be cases like this, right, where we don't really trust our senses to provide us with good feedback on our predictions, because we're in a noisy environment. So when we're in a noisy environment, like either of these, it's important to downweight the error signals we're getting from our senses, right? Because we don't expect them to be very precise. Or if we expect them to be precise, we're going to upweight how much of an impact those error signals have on our model. So when the input is expected to be precise, the error signals can be strengthened. And when input is expected to be noisy, error signals can be kind of dampened. And this kind of what's known as precision weighting is how attention is accomplished in the model. And really for a lot of proponents of this type of view, that really just is attention. And that can be quite hard to get your head around, but I think it kind of, yeah, you just have to have faith that there's good reasons for this. What's important though is once we have this mechanism in place, attention can be seen as a way of kind of tuning the balance between top-down and bottom-up influence, tuning the different, and that can end up playing quite a lot of different roles within the framework. Now, importantly, you know, this is meant to be this grand unifying theory of the mind, so it doesn't just explain perception to us, it also is meant to explain action as well as attention, and maybe everything else, right? So importantly, right, there's going to be two different ways that you can minimize, can achieve that fundamental imperative of minimizing the kind of mismatch between your model of the world and the world itself. One of them is, as we've explained, to correct your model on the basis of the error signals you're getting coming in. But another way of doing it is just to change the world so that it fits your model. And so action is understood in that second sense, right? That's what's going on in the case of action. What does that look like? Again, this can be quite hard to get your head around, but one of the key ideas is that we achieve action, we engage in motion endogenously generated motion via carrying out proprioceptive predictions, right? So you see this little picture in the bottom right. Suppose the aim is to press the button at B. The prediction will be that my hand, or this, that's not my hand, that's a cartoon hand, that hand will be at position B. Now, clearly though, I mean, when I make that prediction, I'm going to get lots of error signals telling me your hand is not at B, your hand is in position A or something like that. So you hopefully the diagram makes some sense here. So we're getting error signals that where there's a discrepancy between our prediction being pressing the button and the fact that our arm is by the side. Luckily, though, we've got this mechanism of attention, which can allow for down weighting of error signals. So the idea is that by, when we're engaging in action, our proprioception is not going to be accurate with respect to the position of our limbs. Therefore, we downweight the error signals from proprioception in this case, and then that allows us to engage in the movement, and our predictions are made true by engaging in the relevant movement. Okay, so this is very much a whistle-stop tour, so I'm sorry if it's not particularly convincing, but you can just take predictive processing as assume it for the sake of argument. Why might you think it's good to have a predictive mind view? Well, I think one of the important things is, as with lots of other views that like that of Helmholtz or Richard Gregory, that take an important feature of perception is that it's inferential, and that allows us to deal with perceptual ambiguities. So we can have this prior knowledge built into our perceptual systems, which can explain these illusions like you get here. So the image on the left here, it looks like the circle on the left is convex, and that's because we have a built-in assumption that light tends to come from above, right? Statistically more likely that you have a light source coming from above. There's nothing objective about the world that light always comes from above, but we've got these built-in expectations. And perhaps similarly with the Kaneka shapes on the right, we have an expectation that it's more likely that there's a triangle occluding some circles than that there's a bunch of little Pac-Men or whatever it is. Another benefit of a predictive mind approach is that it allows for more efficient processing, right? Because when you're in the sort of lucky circumstance in which your predictions are working very well, the world is as you expect it to be, there's no need for all that information processing of input of information coming into the mind, no need for any feed forward processing unless there's some discrepancy between what you predict and what's actually there. And this is very similar to the ways in which computer scientists will use similar coding strategies to compress video files and things like that, right? So we've got good evidence that this does actually work in making things more efficient. And I guess the big headline thing about the predictive mind approach is that it provides a grand unifying theory of cognitive function. So allegedly, the idea is that we just have this one very, well, maybe not simple, but this one framework that can capture all of the different features of the mind. And I guess that's one of the things that potentially might be being questioned in the rest of the talk that I'm going to be giving, right? Because the assumption is it's going to be able to explain imagination too. Whether that's the case, I think is up in the air. Really briefly, I mean, this is just my gripes from other parts of my philosophical views, but I think one way in which that some people find very intuitive about understanding how this model works is that each layer in the hierarchy is predicting the activity of the layer below, and within each layer the computations that are going on are implementing inferences in line with Bayes' theorem. And this is often how the view is presented. So one way of understanding this is that hypotheses from the level above form the priors at the level below, and the error signal from a level below will provide the evidence on which the model is updated to give rise to the posterior probability. And so that's definitely one way in which you can implement this view. But I think that Bayes is a bit of a red herring in this context. I've been very literal in my slide here, because on the one hand, right, there's a danger, right, when we think about Bayes, because of its Bayes theorem, because of its application in formal epistemology and thinking about how we as personal level agents think, to kind of to get to think, oh, the hypothesis in some little part of what's meant to be just some layer of the brain is actually the hypothesis of the agent. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. And I think also sort of more broadly, right, there's tons of other, sort of indefinitely many other ways that you might implement the very same kind of broad picture without using Bayes. But anyway, that's kind of by the by. I'll skip over the stuff about Friston and free energy minimization because you can ask about that after. We need to get on to stuff about the imagination. Okay, so Andy Clark and Michael Kirchhoff have both offered arguments that in some ways the predictive processing approach seems to offer us kind of more of an insight into imagination, and in particular the relationship between imagination and perception. And I'm going to suggest that actually, in some ways, what they point to, rather than making it easier to explain imagination, actually makes it harder. And for actually some of the reasons that Jimena and Adriana briefly mentioned already. So Andy Clark has said, predictive mind suggests a deep unity between perceiving and imagining. Perception, at least as it occurs in creatures like us, is co-emergent with something quite like imagination. And I won't read all of this, but he says, animals capable of forming rich world-revealing percepts are, if the predictive processing story is on track, animals that understand their worlds and that are poised to imagine them too. So just, the very story about perception that we're going to use to apply to all these different animals seems to mean all of, any creature for which this model applies is going to be poised to imagine. And the reason, right, is because the models are generative in nature. So it's this idea that it's the very endogenousness of the generation of the predictions that makes them imaginative. And importantly, since this story applies all the way down to layers that are attempting to predict activity in early processing areas, that means that such systems are fully capable of generating virtual versions of the sensory data for themselves. So you can kind of see how these, top-down cascades can lead to activation in lower areas. It does look a bit like kind of how we tend to think about imagination. Kirchhoff maybe even goes further and says, PP may be said to represent a departure from the received view by depicting perceiving and imagining as deeply unified and overlapping. Now, I don't really see that as a huge departure from the received view, but that might just be my own presuppositions. But again, the really important thing here, right, is that perception and imagination are the psychological results of the brain endogenously generating its own sensory inputs top down. So it's this endogenousness that is kind of meant to be the defining feature that means that imagination is now much closer to how we understand perception. So there's a kind of sense in which it seems like what both Clark and Kirchhoff are saying is that imagination is just the mere top-down prediction, right? It's just the very fact that there's something endogenous in the mind. Whatever that is, that's imagination. You can kind of see why, right? I mean, imagination in many ways is seen as somewhat mysterious in other areas of philosophy mind, precisely for this endogenousness, the fact that we kind of generate it ourselves. And yet it seems a bit strange to kind of suggest that any endogenous stuff in the mind can qualify as imagination. Yet this does seem to be the way that Clark and Kirchhoff are going, right? So it seems they equate imagination with any endogenously generated content. And that seems to suggest that imagination is a building block of all the processes within the predictive mind framework, right? Because everything in the predictive mind framework involves some kind of top-down predictions occurring. So we just end up with imagination being ubiquitous. But I take that to be a bit of a problem, right? I mean, we in the philosophy of imagination, we thought we knew we had something interesting to look at. There's this distinctive thing, right? Imagination that we wanted to explain. But it seems imagination becomes kind of too ubiquitous on this picture. If imagination is pretty much part of all of our mental activity, then we lose sight of what the distinctive mental faculty of imagination is, right? What are we doing when we're kind of doing pure imagination rather than imagination's role in all these other mental capacities? It would seem unhelpfully revisionary just to label all endogenously generated top-down prediction imagination, right? It's kind of just an unhelpful terminological stipulation, which doesn't really help us with it in any explanatory way. And importantly, it doesn't help us explain, the kind of notion of imagination we thought we were interested in particular, as distinct from perception or hallucination or dreaming or whatever other kind of imagery-related thing you might be interested in. And imagery is important here, right? Because I think in some ways what Clark and Kirchhoff are getting at is that imagery might be a good candidate for being the basic building block of experience in all these different cases. Imagery does seem to be involved in a lot, if not all, conscious mental activity, particularly when we incorporate not merely visual imagery, but all forms of imagery. But clearly, imagery is not imagination. Imagery is neither necessary nor sufficient for it, in my view. I'm not going to argue for that. And imagining is something that we do, right? It's a form of mental action or a form of some kind of form of mental activity where you don't kind of do imagery. Okay. So we've got this problem that we need a distinctive notion of imagination to explain. So another option is to go for a view which I think is comes up a bit in other parts of at least Andy Clark's work, which is to see imagination as a form of decoupled experience. So what do I mean by that? Remember we've got this notion of attention, whereby in certain situations where we expect the information coming in from our senses to be kind of imprecise with respect to whatever it is we're trying to do, we'll downweight those error signals. Was in a sense in which you might kind of use this notion of the role of attention to explain what's going on in the case of imagination, right? So clearly, when we're, say, engaging, kind of trying to visually imagine something, kind of by definition, right, the thing that we're going to be trying to visually imagine is not going to be what's right in front of us, not the thing that we're getting current sensory information about, right? So we can expect that the sensory inputs that are leading to error signals are going to be particularly imprecise with respect to whatever it is we're trying to do. So perhaps what happens in the case of imagination is we just dampen the error signals so that they can have no impact, so that our conscious content is entirely driven by kind of high-level predictions. And that might be what's going on in the case of imagination. Perhaps it's not good. Perhaps we still have some higher level error signals. The important thing is that we lose this bottom layer kind of connection to the periphery where we're actually in interaction with the world. So whatever's going on in our conscious experience is being driven entirely by kind of, I guess, offline cognition or something along those lines. Okay, so that seems like a more promising approach. But now we get this problem of imaginative constraints. So presumably, right, imagining is different from other forms of perhaps similarly disconnected from or decoupled from interaction with the world mental processes like dreaming or mind wandering or hallucinating. It seems that imagination is very different precisely because it's deliberateness. It's a kind of action that we engage in, and as Langland and Sands pointed out, it's something we do to achieve various goals. So there's probably a lot of you will be familiar with a lot of the literature on this, but I'll briefly just mention some of the kind of things that you might think are the goals of deliberate imagining. So we've got cases where we kind of want to acquire some knowledge, like the classic case of whether a sofa can fit through a door, creativity, engagement with fiction. We use the imagination for various kind of particular goals that we have in mind. And importantly, right, in order to serve these goals, imagination can't be completely unconstrained. We have to be able to control the imagination to some extent. At the same time, it can't be too tightly constrained, either by intentions or reality. We want it to be able to develop beyond merely just what we intend to imagine. But I think the most important thing here, right, is that achieving the kind of goals that deliberate acts of imagination, the goals of deliberate acts of imagination requires having the right balance between imaginative freedom and constraint by reality. But notice, right, on the decoupled experience account, imagining is seemingly achieved by releasing the mind from the constraints provided by the world, right, by the error signals that are coming in and correcting us whenever we kind of err from what's going on in front of us. But once I mean, the difficulty here, right, is that that's kind of the only constraints that were built into the predictive mind model as presented, right? Once we remove the constraints of the world controlling our predictions, it seems like our predictions are just free to kind of roam wildly without any sense of control. Yeah, so we kind of end up with this difficulty where, like, where are the error signals coming from in order to constrain our imaginative processes so that they actually kind of stay on track? And what is determining how we're kind of weighting the various error signals, if not something about the content in the world that's providing that kind of feedback? So another way of thinking about this is to kind of turn to the kind of classic slogan of many sort of the predictive processing framework, which is, at least when they're talking about perception, can't remember, it's kind of disputed who actually first said this, but perception is controlled hallucination. It's kind of one way of understanding perception in this view. But the problem is, right, the control in this case comes from the feedback from the world. But on this decoupled experience view, imagination is supposedly accomplished by dampening those very signals, right? So how can imagination differ from hallucination? How is it that we can control it? It seems like we kind of end up with another problem of ubiquity. It tells us nothing about how to separate our imaginings from other kinds of mental events. And importantly, right, the predictive mind approach provides quite nice accounts of things like dreaming, mind wandering, hallucination, precisely in terms of the absence of the error signals coming from the world. But we want to see how imaginings differ precisely from things like dreaming, mind wandering, hallucination by having kind of tighter constraints. And I think one way of looking at this is this, what I call the Cartesian puppeteer problem. So I think there's good reasons for thinking that the predictive mind, one of the kind of real strengths of the predictive mind approach is it removes the need for understanding perceptual experience in terms of some sort of Cartesian theatre where all the mind comes together. Instead, we have this explained in terms of just the whole cascade of information downwards. But the problem is, it seems that in order to explain the controlled or constrained imagination, we need something like a Cartesian puppeteer that's kind of at the top of the hierarchy, setting setting all the strategies and the goals of the underlying stuff. So it seems like in the middle of our at the top of our hierarchy, there's still a kind of homunculus-like agent that must be kind of setting the constraints on imagining. And I think it's maybe for this reason, right? So Clarke is aware of this kind of worry. And he even says himself, it seems very likely that for most creatures, acts of deliberate imagining are simply impossible. Okay, so how might we be able to reframe our story of imagination within the predictive processing framework? So remember how we thought about how action works. We can dampen our proprioceptive feedback in order to try and engage in movement. One of the important things about once we understand action in these terms, right, is that at any one time, we're going to have lots of different actions available to us, right? And so in order to decide which actions to do, the brain has to predict what the sensory consequences of many possible actions will be. But importantly, right, at any one time, some of those actions are going to be mutually exclusive. So for example, with this whatever this is on the bottom right, at any one time, right, you could either look left or you could look right, but you can't do both. So we're going to have predictions of certain sensory consequences of actions that are never going to happen, right, which Friston and Seth have called counterfactual predictions. So the important thing here, right, is that actually the control and selection of actions within the predictive processing framework already requires the brain to generate predictions about non-actual scenarios, right? We're always considering multiple possible sensory consequences of actions, some of which we're never going to engage in. And so Giovanni Pizzullo has argued that imagination, among various other things, arises from chaining together predictions of the expected consequences of merely fictive actions. The idea is that we can kind of plan out long sequences of action, with each one kind of delivering us expected sensory consequence of those actions, and that's what's going on in an imaginative episode. And this fits with some work that I've done a few years back with Chris Burr, where, so you might worry, like, how is that different from just merely predicting changes in perception? I think, well, importantly, the body plays a very important role in the predictive processing framework, because changes that result from our own bodily actions are much more predictable than changes that are in the environment resulting from well, whatever's going on in the environment. So we can kind of use the body like to play the role of kind of well-calibrated lab equipment that the brain can use to test the world, right? Because the kind, and this links nicely in with the stuff on sensory motor theory that Maynard and Adriana were presenting. So kind of by chaining together stable effects of body actions, one can generate elongated, fictional episodes in imagination in a more controlled manner than mere decoupled perception. So Pizzullo says, imagination works via the suppression of overt sensory and motor processes. This permits running imaginary actions that produce a sequence of fictive actions and of predictions relative to future rather than present situations. Fictive actions and predictions are not just mind-wandering, but are truly controlled towards goals specified at higher hierarchical levels. So this seems to get us what we were looking for, and that sounds like a good thing. But then I think we get this problem of what I call the problem of radical departures from reality. Because it seems right that Pizzullo's account does very well at explaining the kinds of imagination that prosper by being subject to kind of embodied constraints, right? So, you know, if you want to know about whether you can fit a sofa through your door or whether you can jump over a gap, then carrying out some fictive actions and generating the expected sensory consequences seems like a good strategy to go for. So it seems like in these kind of cases of more mundane imagination or kind of planning of action, Pizzullo's account does really nicely. But we often deliberately imagine scenarios that radically diverge from our everyday sensory motor interactions with the world, right? That's one of the key features, you know, in kind of creative practices, in understanding fiction, and perhaps even in gaining knowledge, right? When we're thinking about things that maybe in the role of imagination in science, right? Might go beyond our normal interactions with the world. So how do we go beyond the embodied constraints on imagination while maintaining some kind of imaginative constraints in the way that we needed? Seems like Pizzullo's approach accounts very nicely for the more mundane cases of imagining, but I sort of think it fails to account for exactly what we may be most interested in, which are these cases of imaginative imagining. Right? So now we get to the sort of final possibility, which is, I think, probably closer to what maybe Andy Clark has in mind, although I think it needs some working out. So you're all now familiar with this Dalmatian image from the poster. There'll be more of these things. Okay, so Clark says, as you remember from earlier, it seems very likely that for most creatures, acts of deliberate imagining are simply impossible. But I elided the important part in the middle, which is deliberate imagining, he suspects, may require the use of self-cueing via language. And so this is why most creatures can't engage in it, according to Clark, because you need to be a creature like us that has kind of external representational media to do the cueing that can kind of steer the imagination in the way that we need and impose constraints on what we imagine, while also allowing for the possibility of these kind of more radical departures from reality, where we might conjoin, I don't know, concepts that aren't likely to be combined in our normal everyday encounters with the world. So how might this work? So as I said, Clark appeals to the use of self-cueing via language. And to understand how that works, it's worth thinking a little bit about the relationship between language and perception. So one of the things that particularly Gary Lupien has done lots of great work on is that linguistic cueing can help steer attention in perception, such that linguistic priming can boost otherwise unseen objects into visual awareness. So there's a really good experiment by Gary Lupien and Emily Ward, where they're using continuous flash suppression, which has its own problems. But the idea, right, is you give someone a congruous cue, like the word chair, while they're being shown a continuous flash suppression stimuli to one eye and an image of a chair to the other. Now, normally, if they haven't been cued with the word chair, they won't actually become consciously aware that there's a picture of a chair there. But when they are cued with the word, somehow that they actually see the chair and it breaks through to conscious awareness. So as you've already seen this image before, and we've already mentioned that it's a Dalmatian, you probably see the Dalmatian quite easily. And if you didn't, here's a nice little helpful thing. And now you hopefully see the Dalmatian image. So let's see some other kind of cases, right? So look at these three numbers. If you kind of look at the number 13 for a bit, and then have a little think about the alphabet, hopefully suddenly you get this kind of interesting gestalt shift. And if not before, then you can see how kind of these kind of symbolic cues can lead us to change our perception. Now, this might not be the best example because it's perception of symbols in relation to this. So I'm going to try and do an experiment. This is not scientific in any way, but hopefully it works. So another one of those kind of dot diagrams like the one before, it'll appear for a little bit. And now, some of you might have seen what was in it, some of you might not have, but hopefully right now, if I say rabbits, look out for some bunnies, then you might, who knows if that experiment worked or not, but you might have seen some bunnies the second time over. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, right? Where the cueing by a language or some kind of external representation can alter the content of our conscious experience, at least in the perceptual case. So the idea is that, look, that the same might be going on in some way in the case of imagination too, right? By creatively combining and manipulating external representations, we might be able to steer the mind towards more radical departures from reality. So languages and images can allow us to cue up combinations of content that are unlikely to naturally emerge as part of our kind of model of the world. And remember, right, the imperative of predictive processing is that we try and match our model as much to the external world as possible and minimize prediction error. Despite the fact that seemingly, if I'm thinking about flying pigs, for example, there's going to be a big prediction error between what I do in the world. Okay, so that's the kind of proposal, right? That actually it's our engagement with external representations, be they linguistic, maybe pictorial, whatever. That's what allows us to steer our imagination and keep it under control, even when we want to do radical departures from reality. But then we get a kind of what seems like a chicken and egg problem, right? Because usually, right, you might think imagination is a precursor to creative use of external representation. Why would you choose to put the words flying and pig together without having already imagined a flying pig? However, the other, if what I've been saying about the need for constraints on imagination is right, it seems like creative use of external representations is going to be needed to explain how we're able to explain, how we're able to engage in constrained or controlled, yet still imaginative imagination. So we get this, which came first, imaginative imagination on the one hand, or creativity with external representations. Now, I mean, I guess part of the reason I have this image is because I think importantly, our material culture is important in explaining how we engage in enculturated imagination, but it's also because I'm going to do lots of hand waving. So I thought lots of ancient pictures of hands would be appropriate. So I think this is kind of not worked out really at all, but so I'm really interested to hear what you think about this. But I think we should really start, if we kind of want to buy into something like the predictive processing framework, or really any framework that takes the kind of main aim of the mind is to kind of closely match with reality, then we should take seriously the idea that our capacity for imaginative imagination depends on developing the capacity for external creative practices. The external creative practices, playing around with words, playing around with pictures, those are the things that enable the possibility of imagining imaginatively. So perhaps what, how, and perhaps even whether one can imagine will depend on the kinds of creative practices one's engaged in or being exposed to. And so I think that Amy Kind is right to argue that imagination is a skill, but I take it that it's the kind of skill that actually depends on external creative practices. It's only by playing around with external representational media that we're able to steer our mind so as to be able to engage in these radical departures from reality, where we're in some ways seemingly going against the very principle of the predictive processing framework by by having content that should, in some ways, produce huge error signals. There aren't any flying pigs. So again, I think there's lots of exploration to be done here. It's common with the philosophy of imagination, I think, to assume that what we're trying to do when we think about imagination is explain some natural capacity of kind of most human minds that's going to be the same across lots of different cases, and perhaps shared with lots of other species. Whereas on this kind of view, we might end up with a very different picture where actually imagination is dependent on the kind of external representations we encounter and the kind of cognitive practices that we engage in, and cultural practices that we engage in. And it's best seen as a result of enculturation. And so I think there's room to develop along the kind of lines of Richard Menery and others work in this area, a view where imaginative imagination emerges from the interaction between our natural brains on the one hand and the kind of creative cognitive practices that we inherit from our ancestors, right? So you can't imagine without storytelling, poetry, drawing, song, whatever, even though it's kind of intuitive to think that those things themselves depend on imagination. One way you might want to frame this is to think about imagination as along the lines of the extended mind theory. So you might think imaginative imagining along these lines is partly constituted by the kind of creative interactions with external representations. But I don't think that, this is an option. I think for those people who are that way inclined, that's fine. But I think you don't need this radical position, because importantly here, the dependence between external acts of creation and imaginative imagining is diachronic, right? Once you've kind of played around with words, played around with pictures, then you can start engaging in novel ways of combining them, and those are going to shape just your brain's workings without having to think that the playing around with these external representations is kind of constitutive of the imagining. So I think that my own way, I think the best way of understanding this is along the lines of Sterelny's notion of cognitive scaffolding. For those that are interested will know about that. Good. So that was a bit rushed, and apologies for that, but summing up, proponents of the predictive mind are yet to provide a convincing account of how deliberate mental actions like imagining can be constrained, right, and can allow us to achieve the kind of goals that we want to achieve using the imagination, at least some of the time, while also allowing for kind of radical departures from our everyday embodied interactions with the world, which seems again to be a key feature of a lot of our imaginative practices, is that we want to be able to engage in these radical departures. So I've kind of suggested or just waved my hands towards the idea that in order to explain deliberate and imaginative imagining, we need to appeal to the role of language and other external representations in steering the mind, and perhaps even like more complex kind of cultural practices associated with imagining that we might learn. It's a skill that we learn, and it depends on which culture we've been in, how we end up doing imagining. So creative practices with external representations are a precursor to, rather than a product of, imaginative imagining, along the kind of enculturated imagination approach that I kind of want to just throw out there as a possibility. So thanks everyone for listening. This is just a shameless plug for the conference that I'm organizing, so submit things to it, and here's some references.